And I loved his very first sentence was, they may be the dullest looking perennials in the landscape. They are also the hottest. So this is back in 2017. Then Mount Cubis Center came out with their Carex trial results. So Mount Cubis Center is in Hockessin, Delaware. They trialed over 70 native species and cultivars, evaluated them for 4 years, and came out with a list of top performers. And this is for the Mid-Atlantic. And the report was released in January of 2023. And it was very popular, and it really got the plant industry even more interested in sedges. It had already been happening, but this really ignited a lot of interest. Again, the caveat here is this is for the Mid-Atlantic, but we can still use this report for all kinds of great information about sedges. And I'll talk a little more about that later. The Chicago Botanic Garden in the Midwest began a Carex trial in spring of 2022. They're including both native and introduced species and cultivars in theirs, and they're doing 4 years for perennials. So we should be seeing the results of that coming out in a few years. And then also we're looking at popular horticulture magazines and publications. In March and April of 2022, it came out with an article, Super Sedges, that talked about how popular sedges were and how we might be using them. And professionals were on this train as well. In May 2023, there was a great article in the Landscape Architecture magazine about the sedge insurgency, written by a friend who has really got landscape architects excited about it. They've been using them, but they hadn't realized quite how popular and widespread they were. And in March, April, the spring issue of Horticulture magazine, I wrote about Just Add Carex. So this was an article where I talked about, here are Carex, they're popular. What do you combine with them? What are some native perennials that work well with native sedges? So it really was the right time for sedges. And I think there are a number of reasons that sedges have become so popular, in particular native sedges. Some of it is people want sustainable landscapes and the rise of green infrastructure. And we'll talk a little bit about green infrastructure and what that is, but really we're using plants and soils and natural systems to create healthier urban environments rather than relying on built structures. And also, as you all know, I'm preaching to the choir here, the popularity of native plants has surged. So that has very much helped, because sedges, as we'll talk more throughout the presentation, really kind of are not the most obvious plants for people to get excited about, but they have real value. And so native sedges in particular offer a host of opportunities for landscapes, but also to add ecological value. And there's also been a shift in planting design. People are wanting different kinds of landscapes, and the way that designers in Europe were doing this, and then that became sort of imported into the US and has changed the way we're looking at planting design. And there also has just been increasing interest from the nursery industry itself. All of these things have worked together to really bring sedges to the forefront. And I think to really understand all this, to put it in context, it helps really to look at the big picture. And so I really do mean big. So here we're looking at the US from a satellite image, and what is immediately obvious, right, is those population centers. And what those lights are really showing us or illustrating is that we're an urban community. We are an urban nation where 83% of us live in urban areas. And it doesn't mean we're all in the downtown of a city, but we're in areas that are defined as urban. We are increasing our density. And by 2050, it's projected to be 89%. And 68% of the world population is projected to live in urban areas. Now, when we settle so densely and we develop densely, there are some economies of scale, because that allows us to conserve resources, to get more services to people. There's some real advantages, but there are some real downsides to that, as you all I'm sure know, and that is the loss of open space. Each day, an estimated 6,000 acres of open space are converted to other uses. So it's like expanding urban and suburban areas can encroach on farmland and on forests and grasslands and other natural areas. And what happens is that we're losing the benefits and the ecosystem services that that open space provides. Things like clean water and natural flood control, wildlife habitat, biodiversity, and access to recreational opportunities. So that 6,000 acres a day converts to over 9 square miles of open space that's lost. And those ecosystem services that we're losing, I think, are most obvious when we think about stormwater and our water quality and managing that, because the green part really, really matters here. And let's take a look at that just briefly. And you can see in this illustration that on the left side, this is under natural ground cover. So we have, a natural plant community. When rain falls, there's a rainfall event, about half that water infiltrates into the ground. 40% is lost or goes back up into the atmosphere through evapotranspiration, and only about 10% runs off. As we increase the amount of impervious surface, so roadways, roofs, all kinds of development to 75 to 100%, that changes dramatically what happens to the water. Only about 15% infiltrates, and well over half runs off. And we know that runoff picks up all the pollutants that are on ground, so pesticides, pet waste, anything that we put on our lawns, anything that is on the ground gets washed into our waterways. But the good news here is that plants offer real, tangible benefits in managing stormwater. And I wanted to show you this video to illustrate really what's happening here. And let me see if I can get this started. So on the right, you can see what happens when bare soil has water fall on it. And when you have root systems that are present, you can see what happens there in that water. But when we have roots, living roots in soil, look at the difference that makes in the amount of sediment that is in that runoff. A huge difference. And in this case, we're protecting soil health. What we know is that, for example, a lawn has less than 10% of the water absorption capacity of a natural woodland. So having deep living roots makes a huge difference. Basically, our landscapes can be a green filter where they're filtering pollution as the rainwater slowly sinks into the ground, or a gray funnel where we're allowing pollution and toxins to be washed into our waterways. Our landscapes really do contribute to a healthier community. And that's part of what is making us want a different kind of landscape. In addition, this really fits gardening trends. As we mentioned before, native plants are really popular. And in a recent National Wildlife Federation survey that was done, they found that 12% of US adults are converting part of their lawn to a natural or a wildflower landscape. 17% are purchasing plants that are native to their region. And 28% are purchasing plants that are beneficial for native bees, butterflies, and birds. Now, this is not just gardeners. This is across all US adults. So that's a lot of people. It's very encouraging. And what's also encouraging is that sedges really fit into this. Sedges do very important work in trying to do all of these goals that we're looking at in terms of trying to have our landscapes be this wonderful green filter. They help us manage runoff, and we'll talk a little bit later about how that happens with their root systems. They help reduce erosion. They help suppress weeds as well. When you have these nice fibrous root systems that sedges have, they help hold in the soil. They slow down the water with their crowns and their dense foliage, which helps reduce erosion. It also helps suppress weeds. They support wildlife, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And they offer great landscape solutions for shade. So we're going to dig more into sedges, but really what I want to say is, we'll think about sedges as foundations for the garden. We'll think about them as fillers. I think we can all kind of maybe get that into our heads when we think of something grass-like. But I also want to talk about them as flourishes, and not in the way that this first dictionary definition says, which is a bold or extravagant gesture action. So not flourish like flourish, but more like the second definition, an instance of suddenly performing or developing in an impressively successful way. And I hope when we get to the end of this presentation, you will feel that way about sedges. So let's dig into them a little bit deeper. Just what is a sedge? We've already said a little bit about them, but let's fill that in a little bit more. So we're going to get a wee bit nerdy, but I think just stick with me. So sedges have linear leaves and parallel venation. So long, thin leaves, and the venation on them, rather than being branched, is long and narrow, parallel. They have small, mostly wind-pollinated flowers. So they don't have the flowers with petals that we're used to seeing. They have very modified flower structures, but they are flowering plants. They are grouped in with grasses and rushes. So they're what we call graminoids. That's kind of a term for them based on the old name for the grass family, Gramineae. So graminoid is where that comes from. So they're grass-like. And they're in the family Cyperaceae. So different family, grasses are in Poaceae. Cyperaceae includes other genera like Eleocharis, Rhynchospora, Scirpus, Cyperus. There's a whole bunch, Dulichium, there's some others. But we're going to focus in on tonight onto Carex or Carex, as I mentioned before. And that's when we talk about sedges tonight, we mean Carex. This is one of the largest genera that exists. There are around 2,000 species of them. And here's your little trivia bit for the night, or if you want to bring this up at a cocktail party, it might just work for something interesting. But usually when you have a genus that has that many species in it, you get a huge variety of different kinds of species. So you get woody plants, you get annuals, you get perennials, you get vines, you get tall things and short things, and just lots of different kinds. But interestingly enough, Carex are all herbaceous perennials. That's really unusual and it's notable. And that's part of what's exciting about them because we have 2,000 species worldwide. In North America, there are almost 500 species that are native. Now, to the eastern part of the US, they're not quite 500, but there are a whole bunch of them. And we'll talk about just a sampling of them. So let's talk about sedges have edges. You probably know this rhyme. Sedges have edges, rushes are round, grasses are hollow from the tip to the ground. So that little rhyme is something you may have heard if you've had any plant training. There's another version of that, which I'll mention in a second. But what do we mean by that? Well, let's take a look. This is from Mount Cuba Center's Sedge Trial Report, which is really helpful. And you can see sedges have edges. What that means is they are triangular in cross section. So you can see there, that's a little cross section. And they have a pith to them. So they are filled with pith. Rushes are round. So the stem of them, if you feel it, it is round and filled with pith. Grasses are hollow. So they're typically rounded, sometimes flattened, but they are hollow. Now, to see this sedges have edges thing, I thought, well, that's easy. It isn't so easy, actually. It takes sometimes with a sedge to get way down to the crown, right next to the soil line, with very sharp scissors and cut. And then you can see here that triangular and cross section. But if you feel further up that blade, it's really challenging to figure out that that's triangular and cross section. So if you're wondering, that's a good way to get to it. So remember I said there's a different version of that rhyme. So sedges have edges, rushes are round. Another version is grasses have nodes from their tips to the ground. And what that's referring to is that true grasses in the Poaceae family have swollen conspicuous nodes. Sedges have nodes, but they are not conspicuous. They are smooth. You can find them sometimes, part of the time, but they are not obvious in the way that grass nodes are. There's more to it than that. Sedges also have unisexual flowers, so the flowers are either male or female. And the female flower and fruits are enclosed in a sac-like structure called a perigenium. Now, that's really as far as we're going to go into that part of IDing them, but just be aware that there are lots of different kinds of sedges and the arrangement of those flowers, male and female, whether they're on the same spikelet or on different spikelets. So here you've got male flowers and female flowers on the same spike. Here you've got separate ones, male flowers, female flowers. All those different arrangements are very diagnostic about which section of Carex you're talking about, and then you drill down into which species you're talking about. Even botanists are challenged by IDing sedges. So we're not going to sweat it too much, just recognize it is very challenging. And For some of those, you really can only tell them apart when they're in flower or fruit. So we'll leave it there for the moment. But let's talk about how sedges grow. So sedges have a fibrous root system. It's shallower than grasses tend to be. It usually occupies maybe the top 6 to 8 inches of the soil, but it's branching and fibrous. And you can see there, that's from Carex amphibula, eastern narrowleaf sedge. They are cool season growers, which means they experience most of their growth during the spring and fall when soil and air temperatures are relatively low. During the summertime, they tend to slow down. They're not completely dormant, but they are not actively growing, especially in the middle of the summer. They really grow best and photosynthesize most efficiently when soil and air temperatures are cooler. So these are plants that are really at the forefront or looking their best during the spring. And in fall, they'll get a second flush of growth after they've kind of slowed down in summertime. They spring, and because of that cool season nature, most of them bloom in spring or early summer. So they're going to get a flush of vegetative growth. They will bloom. They put a lot of energy into that bloom. So they may kind of rest a little bit. Then they'll get another flush of growth. And then they're going to slow down as the soil and air temperatures warm up and it gets really hot. They're going to hang out and bide their time. So when you transplant them, either divide them or when you're planting them, you want to do that when they are actively growing. I would generally, I'd say just avoid moving or doing anything with Carex during the hottest part of the growing season because they're not going to be actively growing. And so you might, plant them, they're not going to do much till it cools down. Depending on where you are, and I know for us, I'm in central North Carolina in the Piedmont region. We can plant sedges pretty late in the season. I don't tend to do it during, dead of winter, but late winter, early spring is a great time to do that. Or late summer, early fall is also great as well. But honestly, I might stick one out there right now in December, depending on what kind of active growth it had going on. So they're pretty good for cool season kinds of growing. Also, I will note they are more slow growing than grasses. Grasses are faster in part because of their photosynthetic system. Most of them are warm season growers. So sedges are going to be a little bit slower, but it doesn't mean they're slow plants. They're often really nice, vigorous growers. And in terms of moisture preferences, there's just a wide range. You have some that like standing water and some that like it very dry. In terms of sun exposure, most of them tolerate or even prefer shade. And that's why I think they're really useful. A lot of the grasses that are commercially available and that we're familiar with are warm season plants and do best in full sun. Sedges, on the other hand, often perform better in shady environments. And worldwide, you tend to find sedges more often in cooler, moisture environments. So you can kind of think in terms of grass-like plants. Think in full sun, you want to typically think more about grasses, and in shadier conditions, you want to think a little bit more about sedges. That's just kind of a rule of thumb. It's not a hard and fast rule, though. And some sedges, I will say, can handle full sun in cooler climates or maybe with some more moisture, but some of them will struggle with high heat load and humidity like we have here in the Southeast. And sedges really add a lot of ecological value. They are actually hosts for pollinators. So some of the sedges I'll talk about tonight host up to 36 different species of caterpillars. They do produce pollen. I wouldn't say they're actually a great pollen source, but they are visited. I am cheating a little bit here. That's not a Carex, that's Ringcospora, but sedge family. What they also do provide, the Carex, is nesting material and nesting sites and food for birds and small mammals because they often will produce a fruit or an achene that's big enough and tasty enough that it's going to be eaten by wildlife. And we are happy to report that deer tend to avoid them. They do get some rabbit browsing, but that often occurs in spring when there's tender young growth. And what I find is that even if a sedge gets kind of mowed back by a rabbit, it will get a flush of growth and come right back. So I don't find they're a big problem for me, but I do get some rabbit browsing in my home landscape. Sedges have a very short to-do list, which is great when you're a busy gardener. For many, there's no need for fertilization. They will certainly grow faster if you fertilize them, but in a naturalistic setting or a natural planting, there's really no need to do that. They're mostly pest and disease free, not completely, but in general, compared to other perennial plants, they're pretty low key about that. There's not a whole lot that bothers them. We see some issues in container production, in greenhouse production, but that's mainly about the methodology that we have to use there, and especially in controlled environments. It's much more different in the ground and in a landscape. You can cut them back if it's necessary. So you don't have to cut them back every season. I do find that after a few seasons, if I don't, they get a bit tattered looking. They get kind of thatchy and too dense. And so what I will do is then cut them back. But often what I do if I don't cut them back is I'll sort of do what I call grooming them. I'll rake through them and pull out any dead material that's there. If you've got a lot of them, that may not be practical, but it's fine just to go through with a rake and kind of rake through the crown and get out some of that dead material. I will say too, if you cut them back, you would do that, of course, late winter or early spring. Evergreen species are going to be slower to recover from that. So you want to do that with caution because evergreen species will take a while to recover. The other time you can cut them back, in addition to late winter or early spring, you can also at the end of summer. So remember, they're kind of partially dormant, they're not growing much. They will get a fall flush of growth. So you can, if they look really terrible and you really can't stand it, you can give them a cut back in late summer and they will get another flush. They're not going to look as full as they would have with a cut back before the spring flush, but they will fill in to some extent. Okay, now that we have talked about sort of the why and what they are, we're going to talk more about the how. We're going to look at better landscapes. How do we build those with sedges? And we're going to find some solutions with these sedges, some landscape solutions. All right, so let's take a look. This is in my neighborhood in North Carolina, and this was a brand new house. It was a tear down, and they built this beautiful home. And their landscape was pretty minimalist. It's a builder's landscape. And I think this landscape, probably none of y'all on the call here would choose this landscape. There's nothing wrong with it, but I think we have to think about what resources are going into maintaining this landscape. What are the costs of this? So that grass has to be mowed. There's a lot going on there. There are tangible and intangible costs to this. And what benefits are we getting from it? What ecological value? Is it helping us manage stormwater? Is it providing resources for wildlife? Is it a place people want to be? I think one of the interesting things to me about this landscape is that if you see the big picture, it is right next to this big old willow oak tree that is probably nearing the end of its life. It's an urban tree and has been there for a very long time. But what you can see is in the neighboring lot, turfgrass does not grow underneath established trees. This turfgrass is likely not going to last very long, but it's kind of the default, right? And we see this all over the place in standard landscapes, underneath trees, mulch or turfgrass or something like that. And we're yielding to a default here. And that default can be resource intense and has limited benefits. So here's that common landscape approach: turf, mulch, trees. And sometimes they're getting really pretty. I love crepe myrtles as much as anyone, but we know they're starting to have major problems. And this site, even though it's fairly simple, still offers some challenges. You can see this is some rainwater has fallen. There's some low spots here that may never dry out. We also know, as I mentioned, turf won't grow in shade. So underneath these trees, there's just not, it's not going to grow. When there are droughty conditions, you've got to think about what's happening to those trees and this ivy there, their washouts and erosion. This spot, and I've covered it up for you, is too steep to mow, so they have to use a weed eater. They also, I know, spray pesticides or herbicides on this to get rid of the weeds because, as we know, mulch does not prevent weeds long term. It really is a temporary solution. When we're installing plants, we can mulch, but it's not a long-term solution as a ground cover. So we've got these challenges in the site. I think there are also some dreams here. I think while it's okay, it has so much potential. There's so much more we could be doing with this landscape. We can increase ecological function. We want to spend less time dealing with weeds. We don't want to have to use herbicide. And as much as I like a little zen weeding, I don't want to spend all of my gardening time doing that. And we want to mow less often. We want to conserve resources. There is a great alternative to this. There's a different approach. So we can reduce the area of traditional lawn, swap mulch for more plants, and use native plants. And we're going to talk about using sedges tonight that provide a similar look or function, but use fewer resources. That's going to help us increase biodiversity and gain ecosystem services. Now, to realize all this, I'm going to focus tonight on function. And the first of those is covering the ground. We're going to cover the ground. We want something that's low growing and easy. We're going to manage runoff, just like we talked about earlier. We're going to provide wildlife habitat and reduce weed competition. What we're going to do is create a living mulch. And that can be done with sedges. And it might look like this, something we usually think of like a ground cover that's big sweeps of the same kind of plant that you might see in a public institution here like Glenstone in Potomac, Maryland. It's a museum park. Or Kiwanis Park in Raleigh, where rather than mulching or just using turf grass underneath these trees, they put in a much more dynamic landscape with sedges as their foundation. And we can also think about sedges as a planting matrix. Now, I'm hoping and I'm guessing a lot of you all have heard this term, a matrix, but it really is a base layer of a more complex planting. And so it may include other ground level species, where they're planting these taller species into this base layer. I love this illustration from Planting in a Post-Wild World from Claudia West and Thomas Rayner wrote their book back in 2015. Can't believe it's been 10 years. But this is these are layers of a design plant community. I think it's a really great way to think about creating this very complex ecosystem and having a designed plant community. And at the top, you've got a structural layer. In the middle, you've got a seasonal theme layer where you have you've created garden rooms with your structural layer. You've got design there. You've got design happening in the seasonal theme layer where you can have different plants blooming at different times of years to create patterns and legibility and make that look very intentional. And then you've got this functional layer down below, the ground cover layer. And that's where a lot of the work is happening, that functional layer where you're managing stormwater, you're slowing it down, you're letting it infiltrate. You're providing cover and habitat for wildlife at that ground plane layer, places for insects to overwinter and complete their life cycle. You've got all kinds of great stuff happening at that bottom layer. That's where sedges really, really shine. I refer to them as the backup singers of the plant world. You know, they're not the stars of the show here. They're not the ones that are being all showy and carrying the melody. But what they're doing is supporting that melody. They're letting the other plants sing and they are unifying it. They're holding the composition all together. They are literally the foundation. And so we get these ecological plantings that are stable and use fewer resources and add function. They're biodiverse, they're resilient, and sedges can be part of that foundation. It can be very simple. It doesn't have to be complex, although it certainly can be. But on the left, this is in my home landscape. I've got bee balm and winterberry holly with just a rosy sedge down underneath. It can be this planting underneath a tree where you've got this lovely ground cover of all kinds of woodland species. And here on the right, this is on the High Line in New York City. You can see just from a design perspective, the sedge becomes that background that lets that heuchera just pop in the color, and it really makes them the stars of the show. And in this example, you can see this is these are the spent flowers of Polemonian reptans, the Jacob's ladder that's interplanted with Pennsylvania sedge, and it just blends together and forms this lovely melange of green. You had earlier in the season, you had the beautiful pop of color with the purple Jacob's ladder, and it just gets to hang out there and fill in that space. And then the sedge just swirling around there looking beautiful. So let's look at some of these sedges that we can be using in our home landscapes for this. I mentioned Pennsylvania sedge, Carex pennsylvanica. This is a well-behaved spreader. It's a fine textured ground cover. It's got narrow green blades and is excellent for dry shade. The caveat with this one is it really does prefer cooler climates. So those of y'all in Metro Atlanta, it's a little bit of a push for that for your area and for me in the Piedmont, North Carolina. In the middle of summer, it can look a bit tired. It looks fabulous in the mountains, like here. You can see it growing in cooler climates. It's really best, but I have an alternative for you as well. But before I get too deep into the plants, I want to mention that for every plant, I will be showing you a range map like this one. I've got it blown up for you so you can see. This is Izel pulls these together. We pull data from the USDA and from BONAP, the Biota of North America program, combine them into this that we've color coded. So if you see a county in green, that means that plant is present. There are botanical vouchers that has been documented in that area. So this is about documentation from a botanical perspective. If you see an orange county, that means it is present, but it is rare. A brown one means it was present, but has since been extirpated, so it's no longer present. A blue county means it is adventive, and that means that plant is present through human intervention. Okay, so we got those down. So let's take a look again at Carex pennsylvanica. You can see that distribution. Oh, my apologies. I should mention too. Georgia's records, from what I understand, and I do not know the background, so I will not be able to address that. But apparently Georgia's botanical data has some gaps in it. So it may look like a plant does not exist in Georgia in some areas, but in some cases, we just don't know that for sure. So I do know that all of the plants I'll talk about tonight do have a presence in Georgia and in northern Georgia. I think they'll write for most of them. We'll take a look, but don't be too put off by that. Most of the cases, if you see it occurring nearby in adjoining states, there's a pretty good bet it is also native to counties nearby as well. Okay, so moving along. Carex pennsylvanica we talked about. And you can see this is on a hillside in the mountains, just beautiful. But what about for those of us who are in hotter areas? There is an option called Carex woodii. And as much as I think I just said this may be native to Georgia, I don't think this one is, but I'm going to mention it for a very important reason. It is also a really good spreader. It forms a dense carpet, more dense than Carex pennsylvanica does. It looks very similar. It takes dry to moist shade, and this one was a top performer in Mount Cuba Center's trials. It responds well to mowing. It has been a very good sedge. Now, that said, it is in fact not probably, if it's present in Georgia, it's probably rare. But depending on where you're planting it, this is not one you might use in a natural area, a true natural area, or one you might use if you live near a natural area. But for most of our cultivated landscapes, especially in urban areas, this would be a great choice. It is a really nice spreader. And as I said, it seems to perform better in Mount Cuba's trials in the Mid-Atlantic, but we're finding it does quite well for us here in the Southeast. So this is another spreader. Unfortunately, there are not as many spreaders that are commercially available currently. There are others that exist, but as the plant industry is exploring and getting to know all those native sedges out there, we hope to bring that there'll be more available. There are, however, a number of other sedges, native sedges, that are have similar foliage, so narrow green foliage. Remember I said these are the backup singers. They're not showy, but they're very useful. But these are clumping species. So these are a number of others that are native to your region, and I've listed them in order from driest to wettest. The other thing I will mention that my apologies for not mentioning earlier is that later on you'll be sent a PDF via email that has this information about the sedges, resources, and information. So I will be listing these plants on that plant list along with some resources as well. So but you're welcome at any point to do screenshots here. I'll try to let you know when something comes up that you might want to be thinking about that. So Again, from the driest to the wettest. And also these range from, oh, and there I was going to show you another shot of those. I've also labeled these that tend more toward, can take a little bit more sun. So Carex texensis will take the most. This is actually a sedge that is unusual in that it likes actually relatively dry conditions and will tolerate full sun quite well. In fact, it likes part sun or full sun even. Carex albicans and Carex scoparia also will take a little bit more sunlight. So these are ones you can push into sunnier conditions. Rosea, radiata, and bromoides are ones that tend toward shadier conditions. And I'll give you a look at some of those ranges as well. As you can see, quite a bit of difference. Albicans is pretty widespread, what I'd call a cosmopolitan sedge, as is rosea. You find it's very common in lots of places. And you can see that distribution. So those are some alternatives. So let's look at a couple of those. Carex texensis, as I mentioned, this has long, fine textured foliage. This one will tolerate some foot traffic, and it's also one that you can mow. You can treat it almost like a lawn alternative. It will handle, and I don't mean like go play soccer on it, but a little bit of foot traffic is okay over time. But mow high, maybe like 4 to 8 inches, and it will handle that pretty well. It is drought tolerant and adapted to heat. As I said, it takes more sun. Its distribution is a little more sparse, but it's throughout the southeast. And you can see it, you can either, mow it or keep it relatively short, and it will just lie down and cascade down that hillside, as you can see there. This is what it looks like when it's dormant. And I think it forms this nice carpet, so we don't have to think about mulch here. We can think about sedges instead. Looking at one of those others from that list, Carex bromoides has narrow green blades, brome sedge. This one's better for wetter conditions. So it likes wet, shady conditions, but it will take average soils. This one has a mostly clumping habit. It has short rhizomes, so it might spread out a little bit, but it's not spready like Pennsylvania sedge or the Carex woodii, the pretty sedge. It is really beautiful though in large masses. This is in a lowland woodland area near me in North Carolina. It's just lovely. And I'm bet that it is present in more counties than just those couple in Georgia. You find this one in forests and floodplains, swamps and thickets. It really is quite lovely. And this is what is underneath those lovely perennials on the high line. So really nice, narrow green clumping sedge. Moving to another one that's great for filling in that matrix kind of planting is Carex blanda, the eastern woodland sedge. This one has a little bit broader blade, so not quite as narrow as those others, and it handles a wide range of soil types and conditions. Part sun, part shade. I wouldn't stick it in full sun or in full shade either. It's kind of right in that middle spot, which is really nice. This one is a prolific reseeder. So if you put this in somewhere, you will have more of it. And that is great when you want to cover a lot of ground. This one you can see is very widespread. So one of those cosmopolitan sedges, that to me, when you see that kind of distribution, that to me says this sedge occupies a lot of different habitats. So it's very widespread. It's pretty tough. This is what is underneath that planting I showed you earlier. And what is nice is it also is evergreen. This is what it looks like in September and then later on in November. So and as you get into wintertime, it's going to brown up a little bit more, but it's going to have that presence that helps perform all those functions we talked about earlier in terms of slowing stormwater, providing cover, really holding in the soil and covering the ground and competing with weeds. This is our winter ground cover. Another one this is one of my favorites is Carex laxicomus Hob, the bunny blue sedge. It has wide blue leaves. Those foliage is lovely. It's a bunching habit. It's a gentle reseeder, so you'll have more, but it's not particularly aggressive. I love it because it's tougher than it looks. It looks like, this would be some delicate little sedge, but it's really not. It handles a range of conditions. It does love moist, rich soils. Absolutely, but it will take drier conditions as well. It just may not look quite as moist, quite as lush, but you've got that beautiful blue color to it. It really pops. You can also mow it. This is in Cincinnati at Spring Grove Cemetery. They mow it and have it as their lawn alternative under trees. And I just love that blue color. There's a really nice cultivar called Hob. The trademark name is Bunny Blue Sedge. That's what most growers are growing because it's pretty similar to the species. It's just kind of easier to get, easier to supply. If you can't find Carex laxicomus, a good sub is Carex flaccosperma, the thin fruit sedge. It is also evergreen. This is at Brooklyn Botanic Garden in December after it's already snowed there, and you can see it's doing quite well. Here's the distribution. Laxicomus is more of a northeastern species, and Flaccosperma is more of a southern species. Moving on to some others, and I will speed up just a little. I want to make sure we have time for questions as well, because I have some other sedges to cover, but I want to keep moving. Carex cherokeensis is Cherokee sedge, and this one's taller than the others, a little more robust. It is one of the toughest sedges out there that is commercially available. It has medium textured foliage. You can see it's a little bigger, about 1.5, maybe 2 feet tall, has very showy seed heads. It is highly deer resistant, and this one is a spreader. It forms large colonies, it will reseed, it will move around. This was a top performer in Mount Cuba Center's trials. They found that it really did quite well in both sun and shade. It will grow in full sun. It gets yellowed out. I wouldn't advise it, but it will take lots of conditions that you throw at it. Its distribution is profoundly, lower south. It does really well for us here in North Carolina. In fact, sometimes too well. I had to pull it out of a small bed because it just was reseeding and was too big. It's pretty beefy. And so I pulled it out and have it more in back areas where I really need a filler. It's native to floodplain forests, deciduous forests, wet clearings, swamp forests. You find it in a lot of moist conditions, but it does handle a little bit drier. You can see those seed heads there. And some public gardens near us, they use it as a filler in kind of their back areas. But they also use it as a very stylish little sedge, as you can see on this slope, because what it is fantastic at doing is erosion control. On the right, this is in that same garden in the middle of winter, and you can see it is mostly evergreen. It is holding in that very steep slope and doing a great job of managing stormwater, erosion control, and covering ground. So a really workhorse kind of sedge. And so when we're covering the ground, here's some companion perennials that play very well with these sedges that I've talked about. If you'd like to screenshot that, you're welcome to. I've also got those listed on the PDF that you'll be receiving afterward. And most of these are low growing. There's some spreaders, some broad leaves, good textures, really nice mix there. So we talked about covering the ground. And to realize some of those challenges and dreams, we're going to cover the ground, but we're also going to manage water where it falls. And sedges are going to help us do that. We're going to slow and treat stormwater, allow it to soak into the ground. And it may be that you want to disconnect your downspout and let your plants treat the stormwater that comes off your roof. Please do not do this unless you have a plan for it and you know what you're doing. And planting, maybe it's a rain garden, but it's a way to help manage stormwater. And we want to keep that water on site and treat it with plants if we can. So what we need for these kinds of situations are not necessarily just plants that handle wet conditions. So we want some of those, but we may want plants that handle fluctuating water conditions too. So those may look like this, where there's just a storm drain there. And we're surrounding that and in here with plants that help slow that water down, treat it, let it infiltrate. So there's less water going into a stormwater system that has to be treated. And maybe putting it up on green roofs or doing something like this in Asheville at a brewery where they're just letting all the runoff from parking lots go down here and be treated naturally. Some of the great sedges for this include Carex amphibula, eastern narrowleaf sedge. This is one that is what I call a generalist. It handles a lot of different conditions. It prefers moisture and shade, but it really does well in different kinds of soils and most other conditions. I wouldn't say super dry and full sun, because it is a sedge after all, and there are very few that do that, but it is a good grower that does well in most conditions of part sun to shade. It forms a dense bunch, and it is mostly evergreen, which is a real plus. You can see that distribution there. It is mainly, eastern part of the US. On the right here at the bottom, that's again in my home landscape next to a deck. I've got it there just tucked underneath. And this one also will reseed pretty prolifically. So it is my underplanting in this bed as well. And it's been fine. At the right there, you can see this is in Silver Spring, Maryland in February after 2 feet of snow have melted off. And so you can see that is pretty evergreen. What you may also be able to see is on the right there, you can see a little bit of blue-green. That's our buddy, bunny blue sedge coming back. So also a great one for fluctuating water conditions. It handles both wet and drier conditions, as does Carex cherokeensis. Remember I said it was a workhorse? This is one that is great as a filler. It's fantastic in rain gardens, in drainage ditches. Loves it, loves it. Other sedges for wet situations. There are a whole bunch of what we call wetland sedges. Most of these adapt pretty well to a wide range of habitats and soil textures. They do tend to like moisture, of course. They're wetland sedges, so not super dry, but average garden conditions, they'll grow pretty well. They tend to be competitive, and that means a lot of them are vigorous growers. Some of them are prolific reseeders, so you want to be sort of careful about where you're putting these. They are, however, really great plants for wildlife support. They provide cover, nesting sites, they're food for birds and caterpillars. A number of them host a number of different Lepidoptera species. There are a list of those, or a whole bunch of these. These are just some that are native to your region. And these are also in the PDF that I'll share with you. There are a lot of different ones. I will say that most of these are pretty beefy. I wouldn't put them in a small landscape or small landscape bed, planting bed. Carex grayi is a little bit smaller and more less vigorous grower. So you might want that if you're looking for a smaller space. But some of these others can be pretty spready, but well worth having in something like a drainage ditch, for example, here. Or Carex vulpinoidea is a pretty vigorous spreader. This is one you might want to put in a drainage ditch or in a back area or in a more of a wilder area. Carex crenita. I mentioned Carex grayi. This one has these star-shaped seed heads, so really attractive, really interesting. It adapts to both wet and dry conditions, so that's really helpful, again, for rain gardens or drainage ditches. Has that lovely long foliage you can see and has sort of this eastern US distribution. Carex stricta is another. This one is tussock sedge, and it's pretty tall, long blades. It does not tend to bloom that much here for us in the Southeast. It tends to bloom more in cooler climates. You will sometimes see flowers on it, but it is one of the most common in the eastern North America. It's one that will tolerate both wet and dry conditions, but you often see it really in wetter conditions because it does take some flooding. What's interesting about it is that in wet soils, excuse me, it forms these big tussocks. That's what's called tussock sedge. Excuse me. In drier soils, it tends to be more rhizomatous. And here's a picture of that in wet soils. You can see those tussocks there. And as I said, there's a bloom there, but that's in Chicago land. So you can see it's much more common to the north of us. So you don't see it quite as much here in the Southeast, but it is one that is pretty common, is often in the trade. And the last one I'll mention in terms of wetland sedges, Carex lurida, the shallow sedge. It prefers moist sites as well, but as I said, adapts to average soils. This one is one that has these really big, fat seed heads. We call this one a bladder sedge. Some of these wetland sedges have swollen perigenia, that where the female flower was, and they actually have air pockets inside, so that when they break off, when they ripen and break off, they'll float down in the water and spread. So that's how they do that. Here are a few other perennials for fluctuating water conditions. So when you want plants that go with sedges that handle both wet and dry conditions, this is a list of perennials that will handle those, native to your region, of course. And then I have a list as well of other perennials for wet areas. So there are a whole bunch of more that we could list, but these are just a few. So when you've got consistently wet conditions, these are some really great ones for that. And so there's some overlap with these as well. And so when we return to this default landscape that I started with, when we think about the resources and the cost of the traditional landscape like that, and if we're covering the ground and doing all those great things that we do when we have a living mulch and when we're managing water where it falls, and we compare that to, the options and all the ecological functions that sedges give us, I hope that you'll think of not only as foundations and fillers, but also as flourishes in the sense that they're performing in an impressively successful way. So if so, I'd say that while sedges may be the backup singers, I think they're stealing the show, and I hope you do too. So I'll wrap up here with just a few resources I mentioned earlier. Mount Cuba Center's native Carex trials of 70 species and cultivars. There's the URL for that. It is also available to you on that PDF. And here are some resources of designers that do a great job with layered landscapes that are really outstanding at talking about how to use sedges and doing building these ecological plant communities. And I will also wrap up with talking a little bit about Izel native plants. We are a website where you can order plants directly from growers. So we partner with wholesale growers and we make their plants available directly to you as consumers. So that gives you a wider selection of native plants and in sizes that are normally not available, like plugs, which are very cost effective when you're wanting to plant large areas with sedges, for example. So we give you access to wholesale growers that you might not normally be able to buy from. And through our website, you can order from us through all these growers and get them shipped directly to you from the grower and on the dates that the weeks that you choose. So I can answer questions on that if people have them. And I'll remind you too that we have lots of resources on the website for you. I'll invite you to visit those. And then also, if you want to know about new postings, new articles, new plants, when we run discounts or specials or new plants are available, you're welcome to sign up for our newsletter. It usually comes once a week. You can scan that QR code, or at the bottom of every page, there is a footer and there is a sign up spot there. So with that, I'll say thank you for joining me, and that concludes my presentation.
Using that Izel resource from an educational standpoint is really incredible. I mean, so if you've never gone to the site or seen it, I can vouch for it because I planted sedges in my yard and other people's yards. And it really is great, the information that you can get for it. So if you're interested in actually using these, I would highly encourage you to go there and look at it. So the question that I had was, you mentioned when cutting back sedges, to kind of generate some regrowth, how far down do you cut and what tool do you recommend for cutting?
Oh, great question, Michael. So I'll start with saying what you don't want to do. What you don't want to do is get into the growing points, the nodes. So you don't want to skin it right at ground level. I would say leave as much room as you feel comfortable leaving or that you want to have. So if you're cutting back, some of it's thinking about why you're cutting back. So for example, if it's because it's looking too messy for you or it's browned out or it looks like it's just gotten too thatchy, I would do maybe, I'd leave at least a couple of inches, but I usually cut maybe at 3 inches, 2 to 3 inches. What I often do is, it depends on how much I have to cut back, but I will often take it and gather it up in one hand, and I just cut with my pruners. But if I have a lot to cut back, you can actually mow it. If you've got sedges mixed, it depends on what you have. If you've got a mix with other perennials, a lot of times you can just mow high. So mow maybe 5 to 8 inches. That's a good way to cut back if you have a lot of them. Or if not, you might do that. The other way I've done it is with shears, hedge trimmers. Make sure they're sharp, but sometimes it's hard to get up in there with those narrow blades. What I think is challenging is to do it with a string trimmer, because you can get it gets wrapped around there. So that's a little challenging to do. If you've got a lot of sedges, I'd say mowing is a great way to do that.
Okay, great. So we've had some questions come through, and Everest asked is, did the wholesale growers have prerequisites to comply with as far as chemical applications? And I would also just maybe also add where the seed bank is from or the.
Oh, right, right. So the wholesale growers that we work with are, I'll just kind of give you all the general and I think answer both those questions. We work with wholesale growers, primarily in the Midwest and the East and the Southeast because we don't ship further out than, I want to say, Nebraska, maybe. We have a limited range because we want to make sure that we can ship plants within a few days' time, so they're not too long in transit. But the wholesale growers, none of our wholesale growers use neonicotinoids on the plants that they ship for us. So there are some I don't know for sure, most of them don't use them at all, but there may be some that use them on other plants, but nowhere near the native plants are grown in a separate location. So if you have questions about that, you can always ask when you contact our customer service at hello@izelplants.com. They can give you that information, but none of our growers use neonics on the plants that you get from Izel. Now, they may have other restrictions about chemical applications. It just depends on what chemicals you're talking about. They may use other things, sometimes fungicides. It really depends on the grower themselves. So we work with growers who are independent. We let them, they use their own methodologies, but we do have standards that we ask them to meet in some cases.
So there's a question about minimum order quantity.
Oh, okay, great. Minimum order. Well, it depends on the grower. So I was mentioning the growers, they get to set what minimums they ask for. I will say when it comes to buying plugs, so if you're looking at something like a plug, those need to be bought and the minimum amount is 1 flat. So how many plugs are in a flat depends on what size plug. If it's a larger plug like an 18, there are 18 per flat. If it's a smaller plug like a 50 or 72, there may be more per flat. We have some growers that we work with that do larger sizes, containerized plants. So it might be a minimum of 8 or 10. It really depends on the grower, but it will be listed when you go to that grower's site. You will be able to get that information there.
Okay, and so there's another question about for pet traffic, cavorting, and daily outings on the suburban landscape in the shade, would you recommend one Carex over the other or multiple?
Oh, would you read it one more time for me, Michael? I had a little trouble hearing.
So for like in the shade, in an area where you're going to have pet traffic and maybe some infrequent human.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, great. I think in shade for that, a number of those sedges we talked about. Let me see. I'm going to pull those up. I think Carex, because it depends if, as most folks know, there's some Carex texensis needs more sun. It can handle some foot traffic as well. Let's see. I'm going to look at my list here and look at some of these. So I would say Carex rosea and radiata can take a little bit, but anything where if you're walking on it daily, it will not cut it. There's almost no sedge that's going to be able to handle daily walking back and forth on it because that's going to create a pathway. For animals, probably less of an issue. So I would say probably one of these. I think Carex amphibula, probably. Let me see. I'm going to pull up Carex blanda is one that is a little bit tougher in terms of, and I'm thinking of low growing ones, right? Where if you're thinking about walking through them. I'm also going to mention Carex amphibula. So these are their foliage. Carex blanda and Carex amphibula look very similar. Most of us normal people can't tell them apart, frankly, but their foliage is a little bit more leathery, if you will. I mean, it's not stiff and hard, but it's got a little bit more toughness than some of those others. So those are two that might be good. The Carex amphibula and Carex blanda. Let me pull that one back up. Okay, there we go. Those would be good ones. I would say the one that honestly could probably handle a lot of abuse is Carex cherokeensis, but it's taller. So that's one you would probably treat a little bit differently. But if you're thinking about an area where maybe you've got pets running through it a lot, so if you've got, dogs tend to do a perimeter kind of run, this would be one that could probably when I say stand up to, it's probably going to be less impacted by having a lot of movement and being run through a bunch. This would be a good tough one to use in those kinds of situations.
Yeah, so Melissa said that she couldn't put a question in the Q&A. So if you do have one, you can put it in the chat and we'll see it that way. But I had a
Oh
question.
yeah,
So for amphibula, that's also called creek sedge, right?
it is. It is. There are a bunch of different names for these. Let's see. We'll go to. It is also called creek sedge.
So because
Yes.
I think I planted some of that next to the road, next to my mailbox, so it gets like full sun. But it has done awesome,
Oh,
which
that's great.
so I just did it as an experiment, but I was surprised because it's not naturally moist there. So is
Oh,
that
interesting. That is surprising because so many times with sedges, you can often push them into more sun with more moisture. But amphibula to me has been really impressive. I've got to say. I mean, I have it. Um, as I said, this is in that bioswale that I mentioned in Silver Spring. I mean, that's in mostly sunlight, so it's getting a lot of more moisture. But that's good to hear, Michael. I think I like this one a lot. It is a heavy reseeder. Have you found that?
no, it's only been out there for like 2 years, but it filled in very heavy. And so it's one that you can think of, I think, a lot as like a replacement for monkey grass. I was doing it as a border, so
Ah,
I
right.
haven't seen it spread at all yet, but it's in an area where if it did, it would be okay.
Okay, great, great. Let's see. I'm looking at the chat as well.
Yeah, so William just asked a question. Can you read that?
I can, yes. And I'm going to say, I actually have, we have um, a blog post called How to Leave Liriope on the website. And it lists, rather than my going through them right now, what I'd suggest is that folks just go take a look at that blog post and uh, because that's exactly what that is. But let me I will mention a couple of species. I think where did it go? Bunny blue. Bunny blue to me is one of my favorites as a liriope substitution. And as folks know, I mean liriope. Let's see. I'm going to read a little bit further. Mulch flower bed and mesic soil. So mesic soil for folks probably know that's kind of in between. It means it's got probably some organic matter on top of it covering it. So it's got a little bit of moisture, but it's not necessarily wet. A species that is clumping like liriope people will not spread a lot because other native plants will be in the bed too. Great. Mostly sun, partly shaded, very specific. So I'm going to say too, this is where when you've got a number of different parameters, this is where Izel's website is really good. We have a lot of filters, just like if you want to choose, wool socks that are white colored and size 8. You can do that with plants on our website. You can also choose sedges and you can break it down by those things like sun exposure, where it's native to, all kinds of different ways to get you down to a narrow list of that. And there's also a chart on our website in the resources area. But a couple I'll mention. Bunny blue sedge to me is a champ. It is evergreen, especially for y'all in the metro Atlanta area or, central Georgia. It's going to be evergreen for you. It to me has that wider blade and a presence. It is not as vigorous like liriope is, but that's kind of part of the point, right? Is liriope is challenging. And there's a reason it's everywhere and takes over the world. So we want something that's not quite as aggressive as liriope. That would be one. I would say Carex blanda or amphibula. And Michael was just mentioning how successful the amphibula has been for him. So Carex blanda, Carex amphibula would be another. I'm thinking too, I'm looking at my other lists here. I wonder if Carex jamesii, I don't know, it's got narrower blades. I think there are a number of different options for that, but those are the three I'll mention. Carex bunny blue, the Carex laxicomus hob. That's one plant. Sorry, Carex blanda and Carex amphibula. And let's see. And I think that's it for now. Are there other questions?
So the last part of what he said was just sun, other
Oh,
than
right. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Texas
That's Carex.
said.
Oh, for full sun and music soil. Okay, great. Oh, Carex texensis. Absolutely. And yeah, which ones will tolerate? So that one will tolerate sun. Um, of the ones I talked about tonight, too, let me pull back up that list. So Carex texensis, Carex albicans will take some sun. It's sort of one of those sedges that is right kind of in the middle. It'll take some sun and some shade. It doesn't need sun to do well, but it also doesn't do well in full shade. So it's kind of right in the middle. Carex scoparia leans a little bit more toward sun than shade. So not full sun, but it would do part sun for part of the day. Some of these, especially if you've got morning sun versus afternoon. But Carex texensis is one that's going to take afternoon sun. And so would scoparia, I think. Those are
Yep.
a few of those.
Great. And I would say one of the other good things is you can get plugs, like you said. So bulk a lot cheaper than you can get, normal like
Oh, yeah.
gallon sizes. So if you're going to plant these, plant a lot of them because that's when it'll really, spell out. So I was just wondering, this will be the last question. Um, in terms of like, if you see it out in like a park area or whatever, and you can swear it looks just like monkey grass, how can you quickly tell that it's a sedge and not monkey grass
Ah, good question. Well, if you have flowers or fruit,
without flowers?
aha. Great question. Okay, so most Liripe is going to be leathery, more leathery, right? And if you go down to the very base of it, and if you can cut it, you'll see that it is not triangular in cross section like a sedge, most sedges would be. Um, it also, the blades on Liripe are going to, well, they don't always cup a little bit, but a lot of it is the foliage look to it, Michael, I gotta say. And if it's in fruit, you got it. It's easy,
Yeah.
obviously. Because as we know, lily turf or liripe is in, well, it used to be in the lily family. I think they've moved it, but completely different family. Sedges, you really, oh, the other thing I will say too is sedges have, and I didn't talk about it. Let me see if I can get a picture. Oh, that might show you a little bit. This doesn't show it very well, but let me see if I can pull this up. Okay, you can see it a little bit in some of these pictures. Sedges, if you pull down, if you take a blade where it wraps around the stem, so I'm going to try to illustrate. So you got a blade wrapping around the stem like that. In sedges, it will be fused together. So a liripe doesn't have that. Oh gosh, it probably does down low. I don't know botanically. I'm not gonna say that because I'm not 100% sure, but I know sedges compared to grasses, sedges have a fused leaf sheath. Grasses have one that is not fused. It wraps around it. I don't know for sure what liripe does, but I have a feeling. I'm not sure that's a good difference way to differentiate. That is a great question, and I'm gonna find out exactly how one does that with the foliage only.
Yep. And I say that from experience. And there's a lot of monkey grass, liriope growing out in parks, and you might not even recognize it or whatever. But every once in a while, you'll come across something that looks like it, but it's not. It's a sedge. So it would be helpful for our invasive removal days for everybody to be able to.
Ah, okay. So I was thinking just the opposite of there's a liripe that you think is a sedge. You're saying there's sedges that people think are liripe, and that's the issue.
Yeah. Well, I don't know of other
Good.
people, but I've had some problems sometimes telling them apart. I can usually tell if it's a big clump of it, but Some
That's
of
a
them are
great
very
question.
similar.
I will find out. We have there's such a thing as caricologists, people who specialize, botanists and taxonomists who specialize in Carex. So we have people we can ask.
Yeah. Well, thanks again. That was
Of course.
excellent. And thanks, everybody, for joining. I hope you have a great rest of the year. And again, if you aren't a member or you're not getting our newsletter, please go to gnps.org and sign up, and you'll learn about all of our future presentations and future activities. So I hope Santa brings you lots of native plants for Christmas. Thanks.
Indeed. Thank you all for having me. Good night.